I'm Dan Rodriguez, and welcome to the DTFC's YouTube channel, where we dive into anything and everything to help you jumpstart your career. In today's video, we speak to Josh Hill about the topic of networking. If you like our content, please like and subscribe. Hope you enjoy the video.
Thanks for joining, everybody. Welcome to our first live session. I've got Josh Hill with me today. I'm going to introduce him just quickly, and then we'll kind of get into things because Josh is going to be a co-host with me going forward. Josh has been part of a DTFC story for quite some time, so he's fairly familiar with everything, and I think it's going to be an interesting, yeah, exactly. It's going to be a fun dynamic as we talked, at least just between ourselves today, but as we start bringing in other guests, it's going to be interesting, and I think Josh will give you a little background on his story, and I'm going to start off with mine as well for those that haven't met me yet or don't know where I'm coming from. We're going to start with that, and then we'll just kind of keep rolling from there. So to give people background, basically I'm a former graduate from the University of Waterloo in electrical engineering. I eventually did, as part of the program there, they obviously had co-op, which basically consisted of 5 to 6 terms of working at different companies in 4-month stints. So I was very fortunate to have my career started off that way, and it really opened the doors. And I think that's kind of what we're going to be talking a lot about today in terms of networking and just how valuable that process is in terms of starting out your career and then continuing it on. And Josh will tell you his story as well. And I think there's going to be a lot of things that we're going to echo of each other of how we got to where we are. And so, to get back to the story, so I ended up working at a couple different places to start off with. First job I got through a friend's aunt's connection. So basically started off there. That was my first co-op. Then that company, which was Hatch, basically led me into my second company, which is a competitor of Hatch, AMEC. Then ended up working at the TTC, Toronto Transit Commission, for a while, or for a co-op term. Then eventually got into the hardware space, which then eventually got me the interview and the co-op opportunity at Apple down in California, which was really cool. I can talk about that later as well. That one again led me into BlackBerry, which is where I finished my last co-op term, eventually turned that into a full-time gig right after graduation. In parallel with that, I had also decided to do a master's part-time. So, I can talk about that later too. But there was an opportunity to do that. So technically, I guess I have a master's in electrical engineering, specifically related to battery fuel gauge design. And from there, basically, everybody who's familiar with the BlackBerry story knows where it ended up for the hardware side of things, where basically things started to tank around 2014-ish. I think people would argue that it tanked before that, but that's where the hardware team really started getting let go. So that's when I was let go. Good news is, though, I had networked quite well. So the next couple jobs or next couple opportunities that came to me were through people I knew at BlackBerry, which eventually took me to a consulting company that I was at for basically the last 5 years, called Swift Labs, based out of Waterloo, consulting or design consulting company. Basically from there, then I made the shift over to the entrepreneurial route. And that's kind of what's got me here. So I'll probably leave it at that for now, and maybe we'll feed it over to Josh, and he can kind of give you some background on where he's coming from and what kind of route he's taken to get to where he is now.
Yeah, thanks. And I just wanted to say to start off that just to thank you for having me on. And, you've been able to grow a really big community here in a really short time, and I'm pretty eager to communicate that in some capacity. And I think today's going to work really well because we both, just listening to your story, I thought of 10 questions to ask you about moving from place to place. But I'll say a little bit just introducing who I am first. So Dan and I have been friends since high school, and we've kind of been sharing our thoughts on this kind of stuff for a few years now, and we're kind of eager to formalize it a little bit better. And he's already done a lot of work doing that. But I am not an engineer, unlike a lot of this crowd, but I do hope that my experiences and opinions will still be applicable to what you guys are interested in now. So my official title is I'm a research and innovation analyst. I work for Manulife Financial in Waterloo. I've been there for 7 years now, coming up on 7 years. And the way that I got that opportunity is kind of a long story. So we'll probably get into that today at some point. I should say, like, on the topic of networking, when Dan said that our first session was going to be on networking, like, I kind of laughed because in some senses, I'm the worst possible person to talk to about networking, or historically have been. I've always kind of kept really small social media communities. I always felt like going out of your way to build networks in this very kind of superficial, professional capacity was this kind of slimy thing. And I think now that I've learned more about it and spoken to more people about it, I think that's a pretty common hesitation or like discomfort that people have. And I think that Dan and I can kind of give you guys some advice about overcoming that, and just based on some of the stuff that we've been through today. So looking forward to that. Yeah. So I don't know, where should we start? Do you mind if I start asking you some questions first? Because I really want to kind of set a backdrop here. So yeah, so you started at school in electrical engineering, and then I'd say, like, obviously you had jobs before co-op, but maybe you want to talk a little bit about what that kind of co-op experience taught you and the kind of opportunities that it opened for you out the gate. And then maybe touch on, like, if people aren't getting that opportunity, because I don't know how common that is in your current crowd, how they can maybe make up for some of that.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's interesting to, when you think back on what the path was, you kind of realize that each opportunity was a stepping stone to the next opportunity. And that's really how I think of my entire career pathway so far, is just each opportunity just had something there that allowed me to take a next step, and then the next step, and then the next step, right? So, I mean, even if we look back at the very first co-op I had, technically it was through my sister's friend's aunt, who I basically talked to one, because I went over to her house and said, hey, I'm looking for a co-op. And I mean, I decided to try go that route because I realized, or I had heard that going the traditional route of going through the system was going to be pretty difficult. So they suggested, even in their first year, if you can find a job outside or through an external source, like, definitely try and do that. So I mean, I took that one to heart and went there. To be honest, I didn't even realize until I started on the job that it wasn't an electrical engineering type role. I actually was part of, like, the learning and development group, so it actually had nothing to do with engineering. So I basically did a bunch of, like, maybe Excel spreadsheet stuff or some, like, crunching data entry kind of stuff. Not super relevant to electrical engineering in general, but again, the interesting part of that is that just by having that name of that company on my resume opened the door for the interviews that I got with AMEC, which is, I guess, a competitor of Hatch, which then allowed me to take or get that opportunity, which was electrical engineering based. Right. So I think that's just something that I definitely recommend to people as well, is, like, don't worry too much about the specific experience and what you're getting out of it all the time, because you never really know, right? I mean, just taking the opportunity itself, if I had decided, or if I had found out beforehand that that job title or what the role was going to be wasn't related to what I was supposed to be doing in my program, I might not have taken that, and then that might have not opened the door for the next job, right?
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And something I think about when I think back to that time is just how narrow my sense of awareness was back then. So I'm curious to ask you if you were kind of in a similar state, because when I go back to that time and then trace the path from there to now, I would say one of the things that stands out to me the most is that expanding of that circle of awareness. And I think that, like, we'll talk a little more later about how we define networking and what we see it as, but I really think that in the simplest terms for me, it's curiosity and awareness. And part of internalizing those kind of values is going to be what's going to help you get over that feeling of that sliminess kind of that I mentioned earlier. But it's not always an easy transition process. It's not something that you necessarily want to be, like, turning on and off, as opposed to just, like, making it a part of you if you really want to be smooth or good at it. Yeah, so I don't know, maybe we can track some of that, some of those steps, because I know for you it's definitely been a similar process just out of the conversations that we've had, but I'm curious to hear it in your own words.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess the point about awareness, I would say I definitely didn't have much awareness back then. I mean, tracing it back now, like it all seems to make sense, or it all seems to be that step-by-step process. But as I was in it, like I didn't really have any clue that that was what was happening, or I definitely didn't really have the awareness that, oh, I should work at this place because that'll open the door for the next place, right? I mean, I would argue that I've been quite fortunate that these opportunities have been there and that I've been able to take advantage of them. I think that's probably one of the few things that I could say is that I took control of, is that when the opportunity presented itself, I didn't shy away from it. I did try and take that opportunity regardless of how much information I had about it. And I think, again, that's the big takeaway for me, is just if I had turned down those opportunities, I might not be where I am today, right?
And like, why, let's say you were like, what are some reasons that you might be tempted to turn down those opportunities? You mentioned the kind of like lack of relevance of that initial job. Do you think people sometimes overthink that kind of thing, especially early in their career, where they should just be accepting opportunities, or should there be kind of an explicit plan? Because I know a lot of people that operate that way too, or would like to.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I think you just have to focus on what the value could be, but I mean, not really worry about it too much. I mean, kind of going on a bit of a tangent here, is like right at the beginning, I was very focused on how much I was going to get paid. And I mean, looking back on it now, that probably shouldn't have been anything even close to being on my mind, but it obviously was at the time. And I was just fortunate that, so I mean, even that first job, I think they were starting me at like $15 an hour, and this was before like minimum wage became $15. So like I already should have been happy with that, because like I compared to my grocery job, which was like $7 an hour, which like a 30-cent raise there felt like amazing. Compared to that, like $15 should have been great. But right off the gate, I asked them for an extra dollar, and they actually did it. So I was like, okay, cool, why not, right? I mean, I don't think it hurts to ask, but I mean, even then, I was probably reducing my odds of being successful in that route, just even trying that. So I mean, I think there's so many different things to consider, right? But I think it's just interesting to see when you look back, like what actually happened there and what was the reason. I mean, who knows, right? I think it's just about taking that opportunity when it shows itself, right?
Yeah, and I was kind of very much in the same boat at the time. So something I kind of hope that you guys would find interesting is that a lot of my backstory, or at least was as I was thinking about what we were going to talk about today, is like making up for mistakes. And just looking at the profiles of at least the part of your group that's gone through and introduced themselves, which I encourage everyone to do, is that by virtue of the programs you were in, you're probably already a few steps ahead of where I even started. But every mistake is a learning opportunity, and a lot of where I've come from since then has been making up for some of those. So like to give you an example, and to kind of emphasize the antisocial position I was starting from, like I went to Wilfrid Laurier University for kinesiology initially, because kinesiology was a sort of a passing interest that was relevant to my high school education, but mostly because a lot of my friends were going to Laurier, and it was within a reasonable distance from my home. Which is obviously not the best reason. And then I extended that even further by spending most of my time with those same people in the time that I was in university, as opposed to growing that network and looking outward. But I will say one of the things that I did identify at that time was that my social life was kind of not going in the direction that I wanted it to. And I think that was one of the kind of key things I was able to acknowledge at that stage, is that I wasn't getting what I wanted out of my interactions with people. And I knew that because I could see other people having much more successful interactions. So it's not like the possibility was a foreign concept. And the other thing, and maybe this came out of my eventual transition to psychology as a subject in university, but my other kind of conviction was that I could do something about it. And this is something I really wanted to emphasize for this group, because like, I don't know, people have really mixed messages on the subject, but for me, if anybody tells you anything, like if you're in your 20s and somebody tells you that you're going to be some way forever, and they're not talking about your height, they're out to lunch. Like, you guys have so much opportunity and time in that decade of life to transform yourself every year if you want to. Everybody has their individual commitments and obligations that are maybe limiting on that thing. But what I don't like to see is that limitation that people place on themselves mentally, and just say, you know, I'm an introverted person, there's nothing I can do about it, which is absolutely false. And I know that a subject of your training and networking is kind of the function of practice in getting better at these things. And social skills are absolutely a subject that's amenable to that kind of improvement. So we can talk about kind of the tactics and the thoughts I had to do that in university, but
Well, so
yeah,
maybe
like I think that led.
before we go there,
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, no, I was just gonna ask, like, what would you say was your like mistake, I guess, that you were kind of referring to earlier, right? Was it choosing the program, or was it like not researching before, or like, I don't know, you can probably describe it
Yeah,
better.
like I just think it wasn't even necessarily a single mistake. It was more of a mindset that led to a series of what I would say are mistakes. And like, that's not to say that I'm looking back and regretting any decisions now, but it's just to say that there's a certain way that like I expect, certain expectations I have for myself now that took me a long time to kind of develop and really accept. And the decisions that I was making back then did not come with that level of thoughtfulness. And if I was giving advice to someone about how to make those decisions themselves, I would definitely bring a lot more, encourage a lot more awareness than I had at the time.
Okay, fair
Anyway,
enough.
yeah. So a lot of those decisions just came from just following people, not thinking things through. Number one, and number two, being anxious and not dealing with that first and foremost, because that was really hurting my ability to make decisions anywhere else. And I came from kind of a conservative family that, we spread our wings out into society very tentatively, and I think that kind of haunted me for a long time and restricted a lot of my options. And yeah, like I really think that two-step of like realizing the problem and then acknowledging that it's something solvable was a really important way for me to get out of that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, how do you think you got to that conclusion?
Just feeling bad.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, hopefully, you don't get to that point before you realize that you have to make a change. But anytime you're getting an outcome that you're not satisfied with, is an opportunity for you to figure out why and make the changes that you want to.
Right.
Yeah. So nothing. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm a happy person by disposition, so it was never that bad. It was just like,
Right.
not getting what I wanted out of my circumstances.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting way to think about it, but I guess it's like you had to have some level of analysis that you wanted to even think about that kind of stuff, right? Which again, I'm not sure I had that when I was younger. I think things just kind of happened, but I think definitely as I grew up and kind of had more experiences, and even looking back now, the level of analysis that I did implement into situations definitely made a difference. I mean, I remember even certain interviews that I went into that I had a mindset of like not just offering value, but trying to connect or really relate to somebody on the other side of the table, right? And I mean, I think those opportunities, I mean, even with my background in hardware, the only reason I got into hardware was because of my interest in coaching soccer, which I happened to be doing that one summer that I was interviewing. And the interviewer that eventually hired me for the hardware position had basically just talked to me for 45 minutes during the interview about soccer strategy. And it actually had nothing to do with my tech skills or anything like that. It just, that opportunity took itself from some other area, right? So I think at some point I kind of realized that there needs to be some connection or some way to relate to somebody as it's an important value. And I mean, I think that definitely relates back to networking, because I mean, kind of jumping ahead here, but that's how I think is a good way to network, is by developing these relationships with people, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm curious to hear you kind of expound on the like a lot of people, it seems, are bringing a lot of skills into this group. And the way you just talked about, and I very much agree with you, is that so much of networking is relationship building, as opposed to, I think, what the initial instinct might be, which is demonstrate skills or like display skills. So like, what do you think, like how much, if you were going to devote like some extent of your time to networking, how much would you spend on each of those two capacities?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think I think you have to first start off with just understanding where you are deficient. And I mean, I think especially when you're talking about a lot of people in the technical realm, I think most of the time they are fairly proficient, or especially nowadays, like with all the tools and all the projects and stuff that is available online, like you can go to YouTube and pretty much teach yourself whatever you need to, right? But I think the softer skills, or like this relationship development, or networking, essentially, I think those skills get lost a lot. So I think my recommendation generally for most people is to try and focus on that, at least more than what you probably are doing. And I mean, if I really think about like how I got the majority of my jobs, it was pretty much through networking, right? It was not really based on a level of skill that I had, or the background, educational background. I mean, those things didn't hurt me, but did it help me? I'm not really sure. I don't think that there was as much emphasis on that, as opposed to the actual connection that I made with that person that eventually then pushed that opportunity towards me, right?
Gotcha. Yeah, and absolutely, I agree with that. And I was gonna kind of say earlier, despite my kind of lack of social skill and networking skill, when we were talking about it the other day, I realized all the jobs I've had since I was in university were essentially through a network. Despite my network being small and pretty tight knit and kind of a more intimate network, that was just the way it went. So just to give you guys some context onto my work history, through university, I basically funded my university by working on an assembly line at an automotive plant in the summers, which paid to me at the time a hysterical amount of money for a reasonable extent of misery and mind-numbingness. But it was a great opportunity. It came through my friend's mom, who happened to be the person who selected the students to come work at the plant in the summer. So I was extremely fortunate to have that opportunity. I graduated, I won't get in too much to my university education details, but I bounced around programs, graduated in 5 years with a psychology degree, eventually with kind of biology and kinesiology undergirding that. And I had pursued the psychology because at that point I was very focused on just like doing what I wanted to do, which is not something I'd ever really embraced in my life before that. And then I graduated predictably with very few job prospects. So maybe some of you guys can relate to that, given that we're all a part of this community. But the first job I took was one of the first ones that became available to me, which was actually through a contact of Dan's, who worked at a hotel and was hiring someone to do kind of event setups and portering and some other tasks. And I was like, yeah, it helps me spend more time in Waterloo, and it's beats doing like labor. So I took that job. And at that time, I was kind of more coming into the personality that I have today. And I was much more kind of outgoing. I'd kind of put myself through some trials in terms of, spending a lot of time being sociable and making myself uncomfortable as often as possible, so that all of my regular day-to-day interactions were kind of stress-free. And I was also kind of fortunate at the hotel to be surrounded by other, what I would call underemployed people. So we had a couple of engineers working there. We had a girl who had graduated with a chemistry degree and worked for a materials company, making like a very good salary at the time, who got her master's degree and then couldn't get back into the company and ended up at the hotel. So people's paths are not always very predictable. And we definitely had a reinforcing community that was kind of doing the same things that this community is like currently and going to be designed to do, which is like figure out if we were making the mistakes or just get ourselves emotionally through that difficult context. And just to cap off the story, so you know how I landed at Manulife, I was serving lunch in a room of like managers basically. And one of them had a psychological manual on the table. And I said, hey, like I'm somewhat familiar with that book. Like we got a lot of account dust in those rooms. So I said, why do you guys have that book? And she said, oh, we work in life insurance and we have to keep on top of what disorders and like ailments people have as trends. And I was like, oh, that's really cool. Like, how do you get into doing something like that? And the lady I was talking to right away was like, oh, you need a degree in health science, and was maybe reasonably dismissive, I guess. but I was ready. And this is something we should talk about too, in terms of like the failure and the successes that you're going to experience in networking. But at that time, I was fortunate that I'd kind of prepared myself for the situation through all the discussions and the like visualizing I'd done up to that point. And I was like, I have that. And her tone immediately changed, and she gave me her card, and she was like, you know, good for you for stepping this up. Like, I'm excited to have an interview with you. And I started at the company less than a month after that. And yeah, and have been there until today in a couple of different roles. But yeah, so
Nice. Yeah,
forgot necessarily where I was going with that story, but yeah, it's weird because some of the people I work kind of closely with now were in that room at the time, and they tease me about it. But you know, you don't need a lot of networking opportunities to be successful, to have to make like a radical difference in your life. So, you know, we can talk more about success and failure after, but there doesn't have to be a lot of successes. I think it was a pretty key takeaway for me.
And I mean, just kind of talking through that as well, like how did you persevere up to that point? Because I mean, like you said, maybe there weren't that many opportunities and probably more failures than successes. So like, how did you kind of stick with it and decide that you just had to bide your time or wait it out, or like, what was your process around that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it was difficult for me at the time too, because a lot of my friends and kind of classmates at the time had gone on to do master's degrees or to like work in the labs of the professors that we worked with. And that option was available to me, but I didn't feel like those people were reflecting on their choices very well. And at the time, you spoke about analysis, and I've already talked a little bit about values, but that was something that was becoming a very deep value for me, is I wasn't going to make especially important decisions without having a very good backing and like a very good understanding of the context for those decisions. And so far as I could tell, doing those extra degrees and spending the time in those labs was not, I mean, you know, people were making money, I guess, and felt like they were making progress, but it didn't seem like a good value proposition to me. And, you know, hindsight is 2020, but only one of those people, I'd say there was at least a set of 6 in the group that we were close with, has anything to do with academia or is making any use of that postgraduate degree today. Yeah, which is something I thought you might find interesting, and something I had to dig into a little yesterday to make sure it was still true.
Yeah,
but
sure.
It was very hard. And like I said, we had a bit of a support group at the hotel, and something I kept kind of pursuing my own interests. I think that's something that really helped me out at the time. I read kind of voraciously. I always have. And I used the little money that I made at the hotel to just keep buying books and keep kind of expanding my awareness of things. And I think that really came through when I was interviewing at Manulife and when I was talking to people in my first few years there, that like, you know, I was extremely thankful for the job that I had, but I had a very wide scope of interest, and I expected that to continue growing, especially through the position. I think, you know, I talked about making mistakes, but I think I did make some good choices there too, and that was one of them.
Yeah, because I mean, I think that's one of the things that, I mean, I've talked to a lot of students about, and I think it comes up fairly frequently, is like, why should we even network in the first place, right? Because you do find a lot of failure first before you find success. And I mean, it definitely can be discouraging. So it's like, how do you persevere through that? How do you stay resilient? And especially when you're having failure after failure after failure, and then how do you build that skill, right? I mean, obviously, I think this is one of my values, that you learn from your mistakes, right? I mean, I think a lot of people think like that too, but I think when you're failing so constantly, I think, how do you, I guess, find the little successes within those layers to be able to keep going through it, right?
Yeah, and I absolutely agree that analysis is a big part of the solution. Understanding why you're failing, understanding what you could be doing to improve your odds of success. But also, like, you know, we've brought up a couple of times already, expanding that realm of awareness. And that's something that this realization actually hit me in the interview at Manulife, because obviously as soon as I had the opportunity to do that interview, I was ecstatic, and I studied everything I could for like the weeks leading up to it about the position. And with all due respect to the lady interviewing me, as soon as I started talking about those details and she started responding to me, I realized that her knowledge eclipsed mine by orders of magnitude. Like, it's very intimidating. I was like, man, I just spent 2 weeks trying to learn about this. When you're a student, 2 weeks studying something, that's more time I spent than I spent on most of my classes.
Yeah.
I felt like I had a grasp of this and I got the concepts. And then she threw a couple of questions at me and I was like, okay, I understand nothing. But I was also pretty open and honest about that.
Well, yeah, I mean, actually, maybe you can talk us through that interview process or that interview itself, if you remember, like to the details like that. Because I think,
Oh man,
I
I
mean,
can't forget it. Yeah.
yeah, okay, cool. All right, yeah, go for it. Maybe you can just.
Yeah, like, I mean, there was always the possibility in the back of my head that she was kind of just amusing herself and that it was kind of a funny situation that a guy at the hotel had some qualifications that were relevant to a position that she had open and she was going to follow through on it, but not really take it seriously. So my goal going into that was, number one, establish myself as someone that should be taken seriously. And also just not get overwhelmed with the pressure of the situation, which, as I kind of mentioned to you, is something I had already been working on for a long time leading up to that. So yeah, and I got in, and I don't know how many people like in this audience are actually from the Kitchener-Waterloo area, but the old Manulife building used to be in downtown Kitchener, and prior to being owned by Manulife, it was a mall. So it was a very strange building. So as if the situation was already not surreal enough, I walked into this building and went up an escalator first thing. It's kind of like going into like the Willy Wonka chocolate factory. And part of myself was like, hey, this isn't really happening, so you should just relax. because you're dreaming or you're just having a rough day right now. So yeah, she kind of like walked me into a separate room and I'd say she gave me some kind of tour, but I don't really remember much of that. And the whole building kind of looked the same at that point anyways. And we sat down and she kind of hit me with some questions just like you are now, just asking what was going on, how I'd gotten up to the point that I'd gotten to, and how I'd kind of made the decision to ask her about the position. And we probably had a very similar conversation to what we're having right now. And not many of my thoughts on that have really changed since then. She asked me about my educational history and why it kind of changed so much. And I kind of explained it in the context of my interests evolving and just kind of pursuing what made sense in the next given moment. And I just made some analogies to hobbies and kind of interests that I had. And I think that got her attention a lot, that I was pursuing curiosities, but also in a rigorous way. So I was really into weightlifting at the time, and she actually really pressed me on like how I thought about that and like how I made sure I was making progress on that over time. And everybody who's ever had like a passing interest in weightlifting can give you a very detailed description of how they do that. So I think that was good. Yeah, and there wasn't much more to it. It was a pretty simple process at the time. It still kind of is actually. And that's all I ended up having to do.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting point that I'll touch on too, is that especially now that I'm been on the interview side of it, or like the employer side, interviewing for people, I think it's interesting to talk to people about their own experiences, because you as the interviewer don't necessarily know very much about what that person has done, right? But it's your job as the interviewer to dig in to somebody else's experience, like live with them there, right? I mean, kind of like me and you are just doing right now, right? So as the interviewer, you're trying to figure out what's going on. And really, I mean, it's not really your job to understand everything, but it's more about trying to figure out like how much did that person understand of what they did when they were in that experience, right? And I mean, like I've taught a lot of different people in the industry that interview like that, where they'll just pick one thing on the resume. It might even just be one line, and then they'll dig into it with you as far as they can go, just to see where your knowledge breaks, right? Which I think is definitely something, I mean, I recommend to people, is like, if you're going to know anything about or how to prepare for an interview, it's going to be to be focused on your own experiences and make sure you know those well, right?
Yeah. And I really like the point that you made about knowledge breaking, because like I talked about how her knowledge of the position and the company obviously eclipsed any research that I could do prior to that interview, and how that was very intimidating. But it's also an expectation. Like, there's no executive or person of relevant decision-making power in a company that is not going to know more about the company than you, and they know that. And there's some expectation that you will also know that, but the test is how you're going to react to that. And I can give you guys an example because we interviewed someone a little while ago for an open position at Manulife, and she was very qualified for the position, and she interviewed on what I'd call the positive aspects of her kind of value and ability to contribute very well. And then somebody asked her to explain some mistakes that she made and like walk through some things that she'd do differently, and she said there were none. And I'll tell you, in my position, you know, I work in a part of insurance called underwriting, where essentially we get applications from people who want life insurance, and we have to decide how much of a risk of making a claim those people are. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you have a health problem, although we have to deal with a lot of those and the nuances of those, but it could mean that you have a financial problem. You could be getting insurance to insure your business to make sure that if somebody goes down, ownership of the business and business continuity is kind of established. So as soon as you start in this role, no matter what your background is, there's going to be a ton that you don't know. And you need to be able to acknowledge that to position yourself well to learn those things and to grow that scope as you go forward. And this girl saying that she had never made a mistake and was not kind of lacking in any aspect was a huge red flag for the interviewers, and I think buried her future prospects in that moment. So not to like intimidate you guys, but like everybody has a limitation to their knowledge, and how they're able to acknowledge it is a big, I think, signal in those situations.
Yeah, no, for sure. Yeah, I mean, I think to kind of circle back to your point there, there's definitely knowing and I think it kind of ties back to your initial point of awareness, right? And I think you don't want to be too, I don't know if arrogant's the right word, but at the end of the day, I mean, you should try and know your own experiences as well as you can. But at the end of the day, you're talking to somebody on the other side of the table that has 5, 10, 30 years of experience on them. And a lot of people that I've talked to are really good at digging into other people's experiences. Sometimes they'll ask me questions about stuff that I've never even thought of. I was like, oh, I probably should have thought about that when I was working on it in the first place, right? And especially as a student, having your first couple experiences, like you don't know what you don't know, which is perfectly understandable. So, I mean, I don't recommend trying to overstate yourself too far. I mean, you do want to come in with confidence and be able to say, okay, this is what I was doing. This is what I thought about what was going on there. But yeah, like you said, it's a learning experience. And yeah, definitely saying that you didn't make any mistakes, especially as a junior person, that's a huge mistake, right?
Yeah, and I think, you know, you just need to be aware of your own weaknesses. And I heard a phrase once that was like, you know, if your enemy tells you that you're bad at something, tell them something else you're bad at, because you know way better than they do. Which is not necessarily interview advice, but it is like internally, it is an awareness I think you should have. But I do kind of want to turn something back on you, Dan, because I'm curious. I've had kind of the corporate experience for the last 7 years, and you had the corporate experience at BlackBerry to some extent. But I have, unfortunately, I can't say I've had the pleasure of having kind of the small startup business experience. So I was just thinking about your transition from BlackBerry to Swift, and then from Swift to where you are now. And just thinking back on my own corporate experience, I haven't really had the startup experience. So when we kind of hone in on the subject of networking a little more, I'm sure we'll have a lot of similar takes on what the corporate networking experience is like, which is an important thing to know. But how did that differ for you when you shifted into the small business context?
Yeah, well, I mean, and I've recently, just because I've been starting my own business and working on this entrepreneurial side of things, you start listening to these other podcasts. And one thing that stands out, regardless of who you're talking to and what industry or what application, every time they're talking about starting a company or trying to find your first set of customers, everybody always talks about starting with your own network, right? Because the easiest sell is to people you already know, right? I mean, same as just like right now. Like, should I ask some random Joe Blow person to be my co-host, or should I ask Josh because I already know Josh and we have developed a relationship together to be able to understand how we're going to interact? And it's always easier from a customer perspective to have, there's this concept of repeat customer. It's always easier to land a repeat customer or to sell to the same customer that you've already had, as opposed to going out and getting a new one, right? And that concept from a networking perspective is just how a lot of small businesses or how a lot of startups really get going, is they leverage their network, right? Which definitely going from BlackBerry to Swift Labs, that's exactly what we did. They had started just before I got there, but I was relatively early on. But every customer that we had right at the beginning, probably for a long time, was other people that we knew at BlackBerry that when they got laid off, they went to all these different companies, and then they eventually, when they needed certain services or they needed help with something, they know who to go to, right? So it's
Right.
Again, it's just the mentality there is just about who you know, or being able to leverage your network. And I think, I'm sure you could tie that back to the corporate scenario too. Who do you talk to when you have a problem, right? It's probably somebody you already know, as opposed to reaching out to somebody brand new or a different company or a different department even, right?
Yeah, and I think this is where we could kind of invoke this concept of networking as the potential for a value exchange, which I think is a good kind of heuristic to use to kind of figure out your mindset around the concept. I'm sure a lot of you have realized this, but for anyone who hasn't realized it already, when someone is hiring, they're hiring to benefit themselves, not necessarily you. So don't write your cover letter explaining why this job would be very fortunate for you, because that's not really what they're interested in. But I think just knowing, and you kind of mentioned it when you talked about, and I remember that period where it seemed like everybody that I knew that was in tech for a while was working for somebody who had just left BlackBerry. That's a very everyone I was playing hockey with, you and our kind of group of friends at that time was doing that. And I think the question that's relevant to now is why or how did they keep in touch with those people and keep abreast of what projects they were working on, what companies they were starting? And really, I think the answer is just, again, to reinforce the curiosity, just asking the questions and just taking a genuine interest in what people are doing. And I can tell you, in the corporate world, when you talk about knowing where to go to solve problems, that's half the battle in the projects that you're putting together, especially in these big kind of old corporations that are very siloed. And there's not necessarily this inherent awareness of what everyone else is doing. If you're the person who can actively stand up and create those connections, you make life easier, not only for yourself, because you know where to go to solve the problems, but for everyone on your team who's now going to go to you because you know where to go, right? The network kind of grows once you start it off. And it's funny, when I got to Manulife, I had a bunch of assumptions that probably came mostly out of my university education about how the place should work if you're imagining the company functioning in a reasonable way. And that was a very stupid assumption because a company that old is functioning very little in a reasonable way, I can tell you. And certainly not under the assumptions that you and your kind of enthusiastic student mindset are imagining. So you might think that, this essential department of the company must be aware of what's happening everywhere else. Otherwise, how do they function? They probably aren't, or if they are in a very limited way. And that's kind of the beginning of the set of assumptions that I was wrong about when I first started there. So don't take some of those connections and those the results of that networking for granted, because it's not necessarily there.
Yeah, absolutely. There's so many examples of becoming that go-to kind of person that I use. And honestly, even it's not even related to the workplace, but somewhat it is, but there's people that I knew that were the go-to person for sports, for example, right? You knew if you wanted to play hockey or you wanted to go play soccer or whatever, you go talk to so-and-so, right? They're the person that has all the connections or knows when all the games or whatever is set up, and becoming that go-to person. I remember the one summer that I ran the hockey, the Friday night or Friday right after work hockey. People just started coming to me and talking to me about stuff just because, hey, they wanted to play hockey. And I was like, oh, perfect. Right. And so then now all of a sudden that's part of your network too, right? It's got nothing to do with work, but it creates an opportunity for you to be that go-to person. So now other people know, okay, you want to do something, we're going to send you to Dan, or we're going to send you to Josh, right? And these are just other ways to develop your network, which aren't even necessarily related to what you're actually doing in your technical job or non-technical or whatever it is, right?
Yeah, and I think it feels like a lot of our conversation so far has been not like almost in a personal setting and not necessarily in a professional setting. And I think I'm okay with that, actually, because my perspective on networking is so much designed to kind of overcome that initial discomfort with it, that the solution I found was to make it consistent with who I was all the time. And that meant, again, the curiosity. It meant just talking to people and expressing a genuine interest in what they were doing, and that will organically kind of open that circle of awareness and just give you those opportunities. But the other thing I kind of wanted to get back to from what I was talking about before, and kind of making it evident to potential employers about what you can do for them, is becoming somebody like a problem solver, essentially, competency, so that when somebody's thinking, okay, I have this new thing to do, you're someone who comes to mind very easily for them. And one last point before I switch back to you, just that on that new thing to do, something I wanted to mention in terms of my own job. Like when I started at Manulife, I started as an underwriter, and now I'm a research and innovation analyst. And this position didn't exist when I started at the job. I transitioned into this position 3 years into the previous role, and they become more customer centric all very quickly. Things are not as systematic as you might think. And I know there's some people that are going through math education based on the intros on the Discord. And if you guys that are at all interested in becoming actuaries, that's another classic position that has played a very traditional role in insurance companies and is now evolving. So actuaries are expected to kind of shift into data science a little bit now. They have to have an understanding of how to handle risk and how to, in the protective sphere, and also in the prospective, like making money by taking risk sphere. They have to kind of understand business. They have to understand the business. Like actuaries can have kind of dedicated analytical roles, but if they can also talk about the business and apply those roles in a wider context, that's a huge asset to the company. So things are changing fast, and being aware of your situation is often, holding that awareness at the margin of what's going to be different tomorrow, and how can I solve problems for the people who are going to be making those decisions on that margin. And that's what's going to create a lot of opportunity for you.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's a great point. I mean, figuring out how to solve problems for somebody, I mean, that's part of my strategy as someone who's networking, right? I mean, not to tie it back just to the sports analogy, but people were looking for something to do right after work. I said, okay, well, I can solve that problem because I have a connection to rent hockey or rent the arena, right? I mean, if you can become that go-to person or be able to solve problems for people, again, people are going to come to you, right? The point I did want to get back to or ask you to maybe dig into a little bit is just like that curiosity factor, because I think like you definitely have it. I think I used to have it when I was young, and then I lost it for a little bit, and now I've gotten it back. But like, what would you recommend to somebody that maybe they don't think of themselves as a curious of a person, or they don't know what kind of questions to ask? Because I think like even just like your ability to hold a conversation or ask other people questions, like that in itself is a networking strategy or skill that some people may not think that they have. So like, what would you say is how you develop that? Or like, was that something you always had, or was that something that you built as once you started realizing, okay, maybe this is something that will help me be successful in the future?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I do have a couple of thoughts on it. In terms of, I think I was kind of fortunate to always have that curiosity from a very early point. But I think, I mentioned earlier that I had made some mistakes in those kind of university years that had led me to where I ended up post-university. And I think that making those mistakes also gave me this humility, humility that I certainly didn't have coming out of high school. I had a lot of maybe momentum, I would say, coming out of high school. And then by the end of university, I had pretty much tarnished that momentum and was kind of humble about my position. And when you have that humility, you're very open to other people basically explaining how they do things, because you're looking for a way to improve your own process, and you're seeing a lot of people around you. Even like, it doesn't have to be the star of the show. It can just be someone who's doing something a little bit better than you. And you're like, hey, like, this is my thought process on this thing. I see that, like, you're doing pretty well at this thing. What are you doing different from what I'm doing? And that can be a very generative conversation. So I think that's number one. And the other thing is, like, don't be afraid to embrace really obscure things, as long as you're willing to do so, like, to a level of depth. I think of my brother, for example, who's a giant nerd and like, watched anime for probably the entire 4 years that I was in university. And now he's doing his own podcast and like reaching out and creating this network of people who all want to talk about these new developments and like analyze this, very thoroughly. And there's now an audience that wants to listen to that. And I think that's a very transferable skill. Being able to dig into something to the point that you can speak, like not necessarily authoritatively about it, but in a way that expresses your interest and gets other people to realize, wow, there's more to this than I realized. And the more you do that in the few things that you're interested in, the more you realize like other people around you are all doing that and things that you have no clue about. And the only way that you're going to find out is by asking them. And if you're lucky, they'll bring up something that piques an interest in you, and that'll give you another thing to just dive into and enjoy doing. And to just like punctuate that, I think the whole process is very enjoyable. Like I hope that your guys' experience with your own interests is enjoyable, and that you realize that expanding that sphere of interest will just give you more opportunities to have a good time. And really, to me, that's got to be what a lot of it is about.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's a great point. And I think the curiosity part from your own interests is the easiest place to start, because I used to find this difficult, even just going to conferences or trade shows where like you have to walk around all these booths and you have to start talking to people, and you're basically networking like the entire day from 9 to 5. And then there's of course post conference events and all this kind of stuff, but you're going to these different booths talking to people about stuff that you don't know anything about. So you get humbled pretty quickly, assuming you are willing to admit that you don't know very much about stuff, right? But I used to always find it hard, especially in the beginning, even to come up with questions. And I mean, I was curious, but I think maybe I had a little bit of, I don't know if arrogance is the right word, but maybe I thought I knew certain things. So I thought, okay, well, I know something about this. Maybe I can ask a question about that. And then when it went in a completely different direction, I didn't know what to do with it, right? I guess where I was trying to go with that too is that I think it just takes practice, right? I mean,
Yes.
I definitely learned from a lot of people that I was surrounding myself with at that time that were really good at it. And I honestly just started watching and learning from what they were doing, because I mean, I recognized and I was aware of the fact that, yeah, I'm not very good at this. But there's clearly people that are, so maybe I should just pay attention and see what they're doing, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and again, just to like qualify why I think you and I are both so intent on, like, I think when you come to a networking session, you don't necessarily want to hear about self-improvement, but for me, to repeat just for some people who have joined recently, like the concept of going out even to a conference like you just mentioned and networking was extremely anxiety provoking for me. So to make it kind of as organic as I possibly could, I figured I should just spend a lot of time developing traits that kind of like would make being somewhere to network very like natural. And a lot of that was, again, expressing the curiosity and stuff that we've already talked about. But in terms of practice, and this is another thing I want to say about this community, if you're having trouble having conversations or having those kind of very smooth, kind of natural conversations, something you can do to kind of bolster yourself is practice them online. So I was a big proponent of that probably like midway through university. I was very active on like forums and kind of like arguing about just random things. And I think, you spend a decent amount of time doing that, you'll find that you're already having a lot of the conversations in a very safe space where you're maybe just an anonymous person, but at the same time, you're writing your thoughts on paper. You are getting resistance from people, which is something that makes people so anxious, right? Like people will tell you effortlessly on the internet that you're an idiot. And if you internalize it every time they do that, then you're doomed. But it can act as kind of a practice session. Like people in real life aren't probably going to treat you that way. But if you've had almost like a vaccine, like a small sample of something negative, and you've kind of built up a bit of resistance to it, then that's going to prepare you for real life. So I personally think that's really useful. And I think that if you have that background of like if somebody comes up to me and says, what are the best movies in this genre? And I've had that conversation online 10 times in the last like 3 years, I'm ready to go. Like, I'm not going to hold back. And they're going to end up saying very predictable things because I've already had this conversation many times. And that's just going to give me more confidence and get me rolling and just able to kind of fluently express myself and my opinions on the subject. And that's another thing that once you start doing it and you realize how good it feels, it becomes immediately transferable. You want to feel like that in every conversation that you have, and you'll just pick up momentum from there.
It's an interesting way to approach it. And yeah, I mean, especially with, and maybe that kind of leads us into the virtual networking, because I think obviously with the COVID situation and the way the world has been going with working from home and all that kind of stuff, I think like networking was never a easy thing. I think even back when things were open, but I think it's even harder now. And I mean, I think especially all the students who are trying to do that in a like on LinkedIn or through other methods or forums, it's definitely a challenge. And I'm curious if have you tried going down any of those kinds of routes? I mean, on the corporate side of things, like how do you stay connected with people, or have you noticed that maybe your networking strategy either has to change or it's kind of tapering off a little bit right now, and maybe you have to do something else to kickstart it?
Yeah, that's a great question, because virtual networking is so challenging. And I think like one of the ways to think about why it's challenging is just in terms of like imagining yourself as an employer or just someone who's carrying value for whatever reason and people want to get in touch with you. It's so easy to do, which means you're going to be getting inundated and just flooded with messages. And as a consequence, you have to be selective about which ones you're going to respond to. In person, there's a lot of things that you can do to kind of separate yourself from a group, a fairly finite group of people that can all be in one room. Online, there's not as much. I find the like signaling that you are able to do online in terms of like even displaying skills and accomplishments, there's such a high risk of it just being like, people can say whatever they want about themselves online, unless you have kind of a way to verify that. The signaling is going to be, pretty low quality. And you're absolutely right. Like since this pandemic has started, even my network, my familiar network of coworkers has kind of dropped off. And I find like I feel like guilty because I find I'm contacting people when I need things and I'm not talking to them from that place of curiosity and from that like, what are you up to? Because I know they're not up to anything.
Right.
So that's a real struggle, and I don't know necessarily that I have a solution to that. But I will say, in terms of meeting new people in this environment, it becomes so much more important to take the step within your network before you take the step outside your network to someone else who has that connection. Every new person I've met online, I would say almost every, has come, I've contacted someone who knew them that I knew, and I've said, hey, I'd like to talk to this person. I don't want to cold email them because that's one of the like worst ways to make a connection. Can you maybe send an email on CC, or can we have a group call and do some introductions? And that that's absolutely the way to go. I think it really like not only does it just set you apart for taking extra steps to make the process enjoyable, because they don't like getting those messages either, right? This is another thing, like solving the problems, right? If people are irritated by something and you can resolve that irritation, that's a huge asset for you. But yeah, I think leveraging the network is like even more important now, just for all those reasons.
Yeah, for sure. And I think you're touching on all the right things there too. It's definitely a challenge, and I noticed myself doing it too. But the interesting thing is that, especially now being on the other side of it, so I guess I'm less of the networker, I'm more of the networkee, if that makes any sense. But like people are trying to connect with me, right? So now I'm experiencing and getting to see all the ways that people are reaching out and the different messaging styles and strategies they're using. And to be honest, like there's not a lot of strategy that seems to be getting put into place there, which I mean, just kind of opens the doors for me to say, okay, this is something that people need to really learn about and try and figure out, because either they're not getting, and I mean, I don't know if you had any courses like this in school, but I definitely didn't. I never really learned how to send somebody an email or talk to somebody or any of those kinds of things. But like one big takeaway, and I think you touched on it earlier too, is that when they're reaching out, it's all about what they're getting out of it, right?
Yeah.
Even messages I get right now, and I mean, I had a post the other day about internships and stuff, and a lot of the messaging that I'm getting from people is, this is looking for, and it would be great opportunity for me if you could hire me for this. And it's like, yeah, you and everybody else, right? Which is maybe not something you've ever thought of as like the person reaching out to people, but that's how the person receiving it is going to be thinking about it, right? And like you said earlier, like they're getting inundated with all these messages all the time now. And I mean, I think like, not to jump ahead, but Calvin, that we're bringing by tomorrow, is going to talk about that kind of stuff too. It's just, you get swamped, right? And they're just hundreds or thousands or whatever it is, people that are messaging. And if you don't have a way of sticking out or standing out, or on top of that, offering value, you're only trying to extract value, it's not going to go very well for you, right?
Yeah, and that brings us right back to the value thing. But I do want to follow up on that and ask you, what are some of the, like, what works? Because I'm not really in that, like, I get obviously demanding emails all day and it's exhausting. But I wanted to ask you, as someone who probably has to be very selective about a lot of messages now, like, what are the good ones that you've seen?
Right. Honestly, the good ones that come in either have a sense of what I'm looking for, or they are able to meet some need that I have. And that need may not be apparent to them up front, but if they had thought about it or had analyzed it, and I mean, again, like kind of speaking back to when we were younger, I never didn't necessarily think about what the employer wanted or got out of things, but the ones that tend to send messages with that in mind, or what they can do for me, it's like that saying, right? Like, it's not what your country can do for you, it's what you can do for your country, right? It's the same kind of thought process, is that, okay, well, this person is actually thinking about what they can do for me. And I mean, I had a student recently that I interviewed, that it was like an instant, yes, I want to bring that person in and hire them, because they had already thought of things that could help me with my business. They had done their research. They had found out, even just going through my website, which I would not argue is the greatest website, they went through it and they looked for things that they thought I could improve, or that they thought there was an opportunity for me. And especially as somebody now looking in the creatives of the entrepreneurial side of things, I'm always looking for opportunities or ways to improve or to expand things. And if you can present that to me, I'm like, yes, let's have a conversation about this, right? But if you're coming at me saying, hey, I need a job, or hey, I need an internship, this is what I'm looking for, this is me, it's like it doesn't really bode well for you in the future, right? It's clearly showing that you're not understanding the value proposition and where the transactional cost is going, right?
Yeah, totally agreed. And I had a couple follow-up questions for you on that too. And maybe a qualification, like, so number one, if you're not sure what value you have to offer to someone, but you're interested in what they're doing, for example, how do you bridge that gap? And number two, when people are coming to you and saying, hey, I can do this for you, do they need to be right? Like I'm kind of thinking, if someone came to me and was like, hey, I can solve this problem for you, and I was like, I've already tried that and it sucked, but I so appreciate that you approached me by trying to solve a problem, that it doesn't even bother me that you're not that helpful at the moment, you know? So maybe you can expand on a couple of those.
Yeah, no, like I'll start with the second one for sure. Just even the thought process there, and honestly, the biggest reason I think I would latch onto that is just because it's differentiated, meaning that there are so few people thinking like that when they reach out, that when you actually do get to see somebody thinking that through and being able to get to that mindset level where they're offering something like that, it's just so different or differentiated from everybody else's messaging that you stand out right away, right? So I mean, I think that's definitely something you want to try figuring out how to do. What was the first part again? Sorry, I'm gonna have to get you to repeat that.
Yeah, no, the first part was, you know, if there's somewhere that you're very interested in being, but you don't know necessarily what value you could offer, how do you figure that out?
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's a tricky question. I mean, it's a tricky problem to try and solve, but I think approaching it with the mindset of trying to solve a problem, and you don't necessarily need to know a detailed or have a lot of details of what that person's trying to solve, but at the end of the day, you have to just understand some fundamentals, which are everybody has problems, right? So somebody, and maybe you have to start classifying things in a certain way. So for example, if you're a startup founder, you're lacking resources, generally speaking, right? You never have enough people, you never have enough money. There's all sorts of problems in that way, right? So if I'm approaching another startup, I already know that, right? I don't know what their specific needs might be, but I know they're probably strapped on resources. So if I'm making an offer to them, I'm going to think about, okay, well, what resources do I have that I can offer in terms of time or effort or money or whatever it is? But is there a resource transaction that I can make that I can send your way that helps alleviate one of your problems, despite the fact that I might not know anything about what your company does or what stage of development you guys are in or whatever, right? But just thinking about solving that problem, and I think like you mentioned before, I think that's an important skill to really start figuring out. And I think that's the one advantage that a lot of the technical people have, is that a lot of the engineers out there, you guys are problem solvers, right? So now you just have to think about approaching a problem that's not a mathematical problem, it's more of a people problem, right?
Yeah, like no one should have to explain iteration to you guys. And trust me, iteration is a mind-blowing concept if you don't know it from your day-to-day or from your education. Like we just recently kind of applied, I'm sure Dan, you're familiar with kind of agile project management, but we've applied that to some kind of tech projects pretty recently. Like agile training started maybe 3-5 years ago. And the opportunities that come from working in small bits and making mistakes quickly and being a little bit more nimble to solve new problems and be able to adapt, that's all stuff that I think you guys probably understand very thoroughly and inherently, and being able to offer that mindset to solve problems for people is gonna, especially non-engineering people, like I'm talking business people, like that's going to be extremely helpful to them. So you guys have don't underestimate what you have to value, but do place it in context and understand the limitations.
Yeah, exactly. Well said. I mean, I think that's one thing that I think a lot of students struggle with, and a lot of that I've talked to recently too. They can't figure out what their value is. But I think it's also because they're overcomplicating it, right? I mean, I don't think that you have to think too far beyond, okay, at the end of the day, if you're an employee somewhere, you're a resource, right? So what are you offering to that company? Well, you're offering your own ability to be the resource to them as either effort or time or creating value, right? So at the end of the day, every single person has some value, and you just have to figure out like what is the mapping from your value to what that person needs. And I mean, this is like a sales strategy, or like this is what people think about when they're trying to sell products to customers. It's the exact same thing in networking, right?
Yeah, and just to like right off what you said about overcomplicating, like I'm not sure necessarily if this is true at a smaller company where your responsibilities might be a little more diverse, but a lot of times at a big company, like you're there to fill a very specific role. And even though your background and your interests might be kind of wider or a little more advanced towards the like what's new in this field, what that company might need you to do might not be that new or groundbreaking. It might be fairly simple. That doesn't mean it's going to be easy. And this is a distinction that I think we've encountered in the stock trading and other things that we've done, is that there's complex things, but then there's simple things that are hard. And, the simplicity makes the conceptualization maybe easier, but it doesn't make the execution necessarily easier. And I think a lot of doing business is just doing a lot of simple things well, and not, making things harder than they need to be.
Absolutely. I mean, I can definitely echo that from even just this first year or year and a half of working on the company. You don't need to do complicated things to be successful. If you do even just the simple things really well, that gets you off the ground, right? And then it's kind of like the adaptation versus optimization phase. Is like, all right, let's figure out the basics and like adapt to whatever it is we're trying to do first. And then we can worry about optimizing it and making this more complex or getting into like the finer details of things. But let's just start with the bigger ticket items, right?
So cool. Yeah, to be honest, I think we've covered a lot of what was on my agenda anyway. I'm curious where you want to take this.
Yeah, I was thinking maybe we can open it up to questions now. So I will open up the floor. So if you guys want to turn on your videos, or even if you don't want to turn on your video, that's cool. But if anybody has questions, if you want to ask it out, or if you want to type it into the chat, go for it. But I think we'll do more of a Q&A kind of style for the next maybe 10, 15 minutes or so, and then kind of wrap it up. Let's leave it at that. Anybody want to jump on right now?
Hey, yeah, thanks a lot for the session. I really liked it. So one of the things that you were alluding to earlier, Josh, I wanted to kind of follow up regarding that. You mentioned how sometimes, you feel kind of like guilty or a bit weird when you're reaching out to someone because, you need, let's say, some kind of value exchange, but, just saying like, oh, how are things going, right? But, like really there's something, like, I guess it almost feels like you have an ulterior motive. And this is something that like I feel quite a lot. There's many people that have connections with that I don't get a chance to speak with on a regular basis, but sometimes I do want to reach out to them because I think, there's something that can be valuable to both of us. But sending that initial message, sometimes I feel guilty, like, I'm kind of concealing what I'm really after. So how do you combat this, I guess?
Yeah, and I think you touched on two kind of key elements of it there. And the first is that, the best thing that you can do is make that personalized conversation routine. So that if you're talking to this person, even it doesn't have to be that often, even if it's once a month, and you're really thoroughly following up on how they're doing. And then when the time comes where you actually have to ask them for something, you don't feel that guilt because you have that personal connection, and the rest just extends kind of naturally from it. But the limitation, especially today, is that we can't have that many conversations with that many people.
It's a difficult situation, and I think, like, I've spoken to some people about this too. I think the mindset that some people have about sales is that it's kind of slimy, or that people as sales people, like, they're always like looking for something. But I think you kind of want to approach it as like a symbiotic, as opposed to like a symbiotic kind of relationship, as opposed to like a, can't remember what the alternative is, but like a draining one or whatever, right? Parasitic, there you go. Yeah, exactly, right? Because I mean, at the end of the day, like, that's what a relationship is. I mean, you're feeding off of each other, but as long as you're feeding off of each other for like a common goal, or like it's a positive sum game by the end of it, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. And I think that maybe just takes some time for you to get past that thought process. Because I mean, I've definitely had that at the beginning too. You're like, oh, I don't really want to ask people for something, or I'm sure they're going to see right through this. They'll be like, okay, what do you want, kind of thing. But I mean, I think that's just something you kind of have to work through. And I mean, maybe there's certain people that you can't do that with. I mean, another strategy that I generally have implemented recently is just setting up regular calls with people, just to keep in touch. And I mean, you don't necessarily have to be asking for something every single time, but I have monthly calls with certain people. I have weekly calls with certain people. And I mean, just keeping in touch, that helps to maintain that relationship, especially in this COVID world, where maybe previously, okay, like, I know, like, maybe Tuesday nights I had soccer, so I'd see the same group of people or whatever, and you have a reason to be connected and stay there. I think you have to try and take the initiative to do some of those things yourself and set that kind of stuff up. And then it doesn't have to feel as slimy, I guess, if we want to use that word, right?
Yeah, and like, Debbie, I think you already are approaching it correctly by saying that you're, reaching out with that kind of value add that you have already in mind, or with the possibility of an exchange. But I also wanted to make this point earlier as we kind of continue to talk about personal versus professional context. Like, I do think that you have to be able to read the room a little bit, and that when you're creating connections on LinkedIn, nobody's expecting that you're going to call them every week to ask them how they're doing necessarily. Like, people on LinkedIn know what LinkedIn is for and what people are doing, and the what we might call a dormant connection that you're making there. Both sides kind of agree that that's the function of it. It's not necessarily the same as having a close friendship with someone. So I do agree with Dan that, like, for the most part, I think that guilt, a lot of that guilt for people like us that are attuned to that kind of thing, is something that you can get over time, but you also don't want to become like numb to it, right? So like, that's how you become the annoying person who doesn't realize that they're annoying. So there's a value to, like, just read the room, know the context, and be aware of how you're coming across. And another thing in terms of virtual networking, be careful how you type. My humor personally is very sarcastic, and you cannot type sarcasm. It doesn't work. So that's something when I'm speaking online, especially in the business context, I try to be very clear, and I don't love it, to be honest, but I find it helps.
Awesome. Thanks a lot for that answer. It was a really great response.
Thanks for the question.
Yeah, thanks, Debbie. Anybody else have a question?
Yeah, I was just wondering, what's been your main source of like networking opportunities over your career?
My main source has been my circle of just people that I'm in touch with day to day. Like, absolutely. Obviously, I've made connections through some other ways and through some sort of maybe less common ways, but I think that the strength of your connections is something that kind of emanates outward from your network over time. So leveraging those internal connections that you're really close with kind of pushes your ability to meet people on the fringe of that space that you're in a little bit further.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I think the only thing I would add to that too is just personal interests seem to be the main, if I'm looking back at who I've actually developed relationships with or who I've networked with well, it most of the time started with some kind of personal interest that we had a connection with that helped us develop it. I mean, I've never really been a super technical kind of person or like focused too much on the actual like workplace conversations outside of the workplace. I can talk about the Leafs all day long, and that a lot of relationships or connections have developed just purely based on sports or my own personal interest of what I like talking about, right? So I think there's definitely a lot of value there. So if you're able to find something, connect with that person about, I think that's probably the easiest way to maintain something. And then those relationships at some point might have a return. But I mean, even if they don't, even just the fact that you are able to connect with that person on a personal level, I think that just adds enough value that it's worth it on its own.
So Dan, sorry if I could just jump in there to follow up, and maybe Andrew, this hits on the core of your question a little bit more, but let's say, Dan, that you don't have that circle. Like, let's say that you went abroad for school and you find yourself in a place where your intimate network is not close enough to really add much value to the environmental context that you're now in. How do you go about fixing that?
Yeah, I mean, again, I'd probably suggest trying to figure out where people hang out. I mean, in like a real sense, almost like, do people go to the bar, or do they participate in sporting events, or do they go to hackathons or whatever it is? But at a certain point, you have to go to where the people are, right? I mean, it's the same thing in sales when you're trying to figure out how to sell a product to a customer. You have to know where your customers are and what they're looking for, right? So as long as you have some personal interest that kind of evolves beyond just something that's only for yourself, you could probably find some people with like-minded interests, which then just helps you open up that circle and kind of build from there. I mean, that would be my thought. Josh, do you have anything you wanted to add on to that?
I'd say it's hard. Like, I'd say it really, if you don't have that network to leverage, and like so much of it is hard, and we're talking about it maybe flippantly a little bit. I can tell you two parts of it that are hard, and going up and meeting new people is, for me, very hard, especially meeting them past the point of like superficial interview questions, which we didn't really get to talk about today. But I hate interviews. I hate when my conversation sounds like an interview. I hate when my interview sounds like an interview. So I think being able to do that and spend the energy on that routinely is very hard. I think even calling up someone that you knew like 6 years ago that you haven't spoken to in that time is maybe even harder. Worth it very much a lot of the time, especially if you can bring up some commonality that you had in the past. I think it's a really good thing to do, especially now. Yeah, I just want to, like, not to, again, intimidate or make anybody anxious, because it's doable. It's always doable. But there is like work involved, and that's not something that you should expect to not be there.
Well, I mean, I think we've probably gone for a good amount of time here. I did have some other questions that had come in previously, but maybe we can save some of those ones for tomorrow's session, because I think we'll probably be getting into some aspects of this as well with Calvin. So I'm good to end it off here. The only thing I was going to mention is, for those people that are interested in networking or learning some of the skills and developing yourself in the ways that Josh and I have spoken about today, I will be launching a how to network professional course that I will be offering starting next week. So if you go to my website, I'll link it in after this video as well. You can go there. It's a 5-day intensive course where we go through all of the details of what we were talking about here, where we stayed mostly high level, but we're going to be getting into a lot of the details of how to actually do this, because it's one thing to understand the theory of it, but it's a completely different aspect to make it practical and make it useful and tangible for yourself when, especially as I was mentioning, a lot of people are struggling with this right now, and it's not an easy skill, but if you have some of the templates and the tangible, practical opportunities that I'm going to be able to share with you during that course, it should hopefully open the doors for you and at least give you some basis and a starting point for how to improve and take that skill to the next level. Because I mean, as Josh and I had already mentioned, a lot of the opportunities that we took advantage of came from networking, right? I mean, I don't think we spoke much about applying to jobs or submitting applications, but I know there are a lot of people out there that are focusing a lot of their time on finding jobs or postings or any of that kind of stuff. And to be honest, I would recommend you spend your time networking or improving your networking skill as opposed to the submitting application skill, because from a numbers game perspective, I think you're going to be 1 out of 1,000 when it comes to submitting an application. But if you know somebody there or you've networked well, your odds just increase, right? So if you're interested in that course, I mean, you can DM me, check it out. Let me know if you're interested. And yeah, I mean, we'll wrap it up here. Just want to thank Josh for joining today. I mean, he's going to be co-hosting these events with me going forward. I mean, I enjoyed the conversation. Hopefully you guys did too. And yeah, I mean, that's it for me. Josh,
Yeah, I just wanted
closing words.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to say, like I think your content overlaps with our conversation so well from today. So it's a really good way to flesh some of that out. And I'm excited for the conversations we have going forward. I think Calvin, I've only met a couple of times, but I can tell you guys that he really kind of exemplifies a lot of the things we talked about. He's very unassuming. He's very curious. He's a very good speaker. And I think his experience will be very valuable to hear about. And the last thing, like, post on the Discord. Like it's a good thing for you. I talked about kind of the asset of building those kind of conversational and discussion familiarity online. It's very little investment, and I see at least the potential to get a lot out of it. So I really encourage people to do that.
Definitely. All right. Thanks, guys. We'll end it here. If there's any other questions, we'll take them offline. But yeah, thanks for participating, and we'll see you guys next time.